Okay, hi, my name is Lynn Huntsinger. I am going to introduce myself. I'm a range manager and I teach the largest introductory forestry class at Berkeley, and I have published many papers using survey research, beginning in 1985 when the Integrated Hardwood Rangeland Management Program sponsored us to survey California oak woodland landowners, and we've repeated that survey many times. In 2004, 2005, we also received funding from Cooperative Extension to do a survey of forest and rangeland landowners in California. And I'm going to talk about the results from that survey now. I want to first introduce the graduate student who did a heroic job, not only on this survey, but on publishing from the survey. If you follow certain directions and recommendations for survey research, and I always recommend asking somebody who's done a lot of it for advice before you start a survey research project. Not only a lot of times do you not need to do one, but despite the fact that if you follow certain methods and do it a certain way, you're likely to get a very good data set. It seems that very few people actually follow the directions and do the survey correctly. So a first step would be doing that. But all that aside, really where the difficulty is and where it gets interesting is in interpreting and analyzing the data. And Shasta did a fantastic job of that. Shasta graduated from ESPN in 2012 and is currently a Presidential Management Fellow working as a planning environmental analyst for the Bureau of Land Management in Washington, D.C. Here's some of Shasta's publications, and the things I'm going to discuss today are based on 3 of those publications, one of which is almost published, but not quite. There's a URL, I believe, that you have access to that will give you a complete list of our publications, including numerous publications using survey research, if that's what you're interested in. Now, why you do survey research is because you want to find out what people do or what they think or why they do what they do, and that's pretty important because the decisions that landowners make are really important for what happens on the land, especially when we're talking about California's forest and rangelands. There's about 90 million acres total of forest and rangelands in California. We have conifer and hardwood forests, shrubs, grasslands, desert shrub and woodlands, and some wetlands, as I'm sure those of you on this in this audience very well know. And a lot of them are private. We have an interesting history here for a western state. So 50% of our state as a whole is private, and about 42% of our forest and rangelands are private. In fact, more than 80% of our oak woodlands, which is of course of special interest to me, are private lands. So what landowners do and what they want out of their land are really important. Cooperative Extension in particular has a responsibility to work with these landowners, and it's important to know who they are and what they're doing. And as we know, the state is changing. It's changing so much. New people are moving out into the rural areas. We call that rural restructuring in some branches of academia. Yet these private lands produce, as we know, a wealth of ecosystem services, habitat for wildlife and biodiversity. There's a lot of connectivity out there. Big lands that are not fragmented, that are connected to each other. Habitat connectivity, as we know, is extremely important. And we know that individual decisions about the land, the practices that people apply, what they want to do with the land, those add up to cumulative impacts that can cross huge land areas. Our survey, we came up with a cover that we thought would appeal to all types. Our survey, we sent it to forest and rangeland landowners. We got the information from CAL FIRE, from their information which they derived from county parcel maps. We selected the names of landowners who had more than 3 acres. We did 10 counties, and we got about half of our survey questionnaires back, which is pretty good. It was a pretty long survey, so I was fairly happy with that return rate. Years ago, you would have wanted to always get 70 or 80%. It would still be wonderful to get that, but research has shown that it's getting harder and harder to get people to actually open mail and fill things out, as you know. And if you're interested in online surveys, the response rate on those is even lower, not to mention the problems of getting a good sample. We sampled 10 counties. We had good data on the landowners for those counties. We tried to get one county at least in each of the major bioregions that CAL FIRE has identified. As you can see, they're in the different colors here. And I have a little arrow I can float around. The different colors here represent the FRAP bioregions, and the white lines are the counties that we used. So we feel like overall we got a pretty good sampling of different kinds of climate areas and vegetation types in the state. So we are going to talk about 3 different questions today. Each of these has a paper that goes with it. First one, who are California rangeland landowners? What are they doing and what do they want? Now, the basic layout of that is in the CalAg article that you were provided with. But we also wanted to look at if the reasons people own their land, which are changing, of course, with our changing world population, were related to how people manage the land. The second question is, will landowners cooperate across boundaries for ecosystem management? We know that we need to think about larger areas and individual ownerships when we do a lot of ecological management or ecosystem management or even fire hazard reduction. So how receptive are people to that kind of thing? And then where do landowners get advice, and is it useful to them? And of course, doing outreach, any agency or individual doing outreach wants to know more about that, or should. So are a landowner's reasons for owning land related to their practices? That's question 1, assessing and predicting landowner practices. I'm going to stick this guy over here. So we use cluster analysis techniques. We looked at the reasons people own their land, and this is a little bit further than we took it in the CalAg article. We wanted to look at, are there different groups or different types of landowners that we can link to different practices here. And so we grouped landowners that responded similarly to a set of questions about why they owned their land. Now, we had quite a few questions that we asked people about why they owned their land, and they could say whether that was important or not important, or whether they just didn't really care about it. And the results in the CalAg article, you can see them. Almost everybody likes to live near natural beauty, and if you live on your property in particular, anybody that lives out there loves natural beauty. Land value appreciation is also important to landowners, and all the way down to being closer to friends and family. Well, most people give that up when they move out to the rural areas, and to help the local economy, not so much for most people as a goal for them owning their land. It doesn't mean they don't want to help the local economy. It's just not a driving goal for living in a rural area. Well, we used principal components analysis and a hierarchical cluster analysis to identify 4 groups based on taking all these variables and looking for things that went together, basically, the only way I can explain it, and that were differentiated at the same time. And you can do this. We used a hierarchical kind of analysis here, where you can see if you look at these characteristics, you're going to get 2 groups. If you look at some more characteristics, you get 4 groups. And if you look even further, you get lots and lots of little groups. And pretty soon, if you keep on looking, you're going to get each individual landowner if you take all these variables into account. Well, here at the 4 differentiated cluster level, we could identify 4 groups that seemed to make sense to us. One was rural lifestyle. And by the way, we had help from Maureen Lahif of the School of Public Health, who's a biostatistician in developing this technique. Rural lifestyle, people who wanted to enjoy the rural lifestyle. Working landscape, people who generally are grazing cattle or cutting trees and making a living. Environmental, people who say that they own their land largely for environmental more than lifestyle, and I'll go into these in detail. And finally, absentee. It's called absentee here, but in fact we decided to call it financial investor, although a high rate of them are absentee. And you can see we cut the clusters here. So let me go through that a little more about these different groups. These are the weightings on the components that identify the 4 clusters. That's neither here nor there, but each of these represent how much this particular landowners in this particular cluster agreed with, I own my land for land value appreciation, 3.7. You can see as you go over here that the people who were most often thought this was an important reason for owning their land and felt the strongest about it are the ones that we called the financial investment group, a high proportion of which were absentee. That's why sometimes we say absentee. Live by natural beauty. Live by natural beauty. Again, lots of people weighted that as important. Now, in terms of the 4 groups, how they're differentiated, well, if we look at rural lifestyle, here are the things that are important to people who were seeking a rural lifestyle, or who we call rural lifestyle seekers. They want their land to appreciate, but they want to live near natural beauty, escape from the city, live in a small community, raise their children in a rural area, and have a simpler lifestyle. Those are important to the rural lifestyle landowner. Now, working landscapes people felt pretty strongly about most of those variables, but in addition, they tend to feel very strongly about having a family business and an income source. So those differentiate them from the rural lifestyle people, and more often closer to family and things like that. So that cluster kind of hangs together. There's a lot of amenity values, which has been shown in a lot of amenity values, which has been shown in a lot of literature, that even ranchers and forest producers are very interested in these kind of amenities, but in addition they have to consider business. And then the next group of landowners, the environmental, well, here we have arrows to highlight these as being important to them. So if you just think about it, as we have these 4 groups of landowners, and they're distinguished by having different things be really important to them, you don't need to worry about the numbers especially. And I can give you the citation to the paper that explains all this. Okay, so these are the things that were very strongly important to working landscapes people. Now when you look at the people who we put into environmental or environmentalist group, they want to live by natural beauty, and they want a simpler lifestyle, and they want to protect the environment and preserve open space. And they agree with the working landscapes people, and they agree with the rural lifestyle people, but they're not so much into the lifestyle aspects such as raising their children, and they're definitely not into the family business and income sorts of variables that distinguish the working landscape people. And now for the last group, the financial investment. For them, the most important things, the most important reasons for owning their land are appreciating land value and financial investment. So let me summarize this table. I know it's a little confusing, but the basic message is that these are 4 groups of people with different characteristics that hold them together, that they feel strongly about, that we distinguished. And now we're going to look if we can link these groups to how they behave or how they manage their land. When we look at these 4 groups in terms of their demographic techniques, we find that they're all in their early 60s on the average. And this is interesting because in the range literature we often bemoan that all ranchers are in their late 50s or early 60s, but in fact it appears that the mean age for everybody with more than 3 acres is in their late 50s or early 60s. That just may be the time when the majority of people can afford to have a place of their own that's larger than 3 acres. Gender, they're a majority male in each case. The working landscape and rural lifestyle people slightly more likely to be married, and so on. The one that's really different, of course, is primary residence, that this land is the primary residence of the landowner. The people who value the lands for land appreciation, primarily the financial investment group, tends to be much less likely to actually live on the land. That's why sometimes we call them absentee. And when you look at earning income, well, the working landscape people are really a lot more likely to be earning an income from their land. That's what this question means. So that's a little confusing, but I think if you understand that we've created these groups, I have boxes that go with it. Yeah. And property size, financial investment and working landscape both have fairly large properties. Okay. Should trust the boxes. And the working landscape people have owned their land the longest. If you look at the land management practices and that we looked at for each of these groups, we had all kinds of land management practices that people carried out, including I regularly inspect my land. Most people do that. I produce biofuels on my land. Very few people do that. Orange means they're already doing it. Beige means they might do it. And blue means forget it. So clear brush to improve rangelands. A fair number of people are interested in or do that already. Remove exotic plant species. Plant native plants higher than you might expect. Prune trees to reduce fire risk. Pretty clear. Clear defensible space. A lot of people clear defensible space. So what about the four groups? Who implements water quality management practices? Well, the people who do that the most are working landscapes people. And in fact, the working landscape people were far more likely to carry out active management practices in general. As you can see from the next graph, remove exotic species. Once again, the working landscapes people are much more involved in doing active management, although almost a third of other groups do this as well, removing exotic plant species. The working landscape people were more likely to remove exotic plant species. They were also more likely to plant native plant species, to have their soil tested, to build erosion control structures, to develop a written management plan, to clear brush, to use prescribed fire, and to improve wildlife habitat. So they're pretty active in manipulating and caring for the land. Clear defensible space, as I pointed out, really a lot of people do. The ones that do it the least are the financial investor category, the people that are mainly interested in investing in their land for the long-term appreciation value. Not very active. And in general, absentee landowners, as I think probably most of you would guess, are less likely to do direct management of their land. So to summarize the results from this simply, working landscapes group, they tend to be getting income from their land and working their land, and they're the most active land managers. Environmental and rural lifestyle groups are less active land managers, except they are very interested in defensible space. And financial investors are the least active managers. They tend to be absentee owners and not very involved in land management on their land. That doesn't mean there aren't some that are. It just means that as a general group, they're the most likely to be actively managing their land. And the environmental and rural lifestyle people are going to be doing things that help them to achieve that environmental and rural lifestyle. And the working landscape people, of course, are going to be doing things that help them earn that income and maintain the values that they want from the land. And as we've pointed out, we need to remember that all of these groups here are very interested in the amenities of the land, of the natural beauty, and the enjoyment of living there. So the management in the context of landscape scale ecological processes, we all know, I can't answer the question, I keep talking. There's a question, how many acres are you considering small versus large? We were just talking in general terms about the mean that's on one of the tables. One of the tables shows the mean acres owned by each of the four groups. So let me go back to the slides. Ecosystem management. Management in context of landscape scale ecological processes is important. We need to cross land ownerships, agencies working with landowners working with each other. For certain ecosystem goals, we need to work across landowner boundaries. Okay. So to do that, and there's been a number of research papers written on this topic, of course, it requires voluntary labor. It requires that landowners work within and with the plans and practices of adjacent or nearby properties. You have to appreciate those and work together. And of course, it requires willing landowners. So who, if we take our groups, who among these groups and why will they cooperate across boundaries? Because we want to promote this in general. Will the different groups cooperate for ecosystem management? Who are they willing to cooperate with? And what kinds of problems would they be willing to manage cooperatively across land ownership boundaries? So we had a 15-part question about cooperation. And we asked about 3 general things: fire hazard management, wildlife management, and insect and disease outbreak management of plants, not people. And we considered some possible cooperators, neighbors, state agencies, local agencies, and federal agencies. So if we look at fire hazard, first of all, you notice the graph slants this way. And in fact, I think we have an arrow that comes in here. So over on this side, this is increasing to decreasing agreement that working cooperatively in this way is a good idea. So we asked people, do you think it's a good idea to work with fire hazard? Is that a good idea to work with your neighbors, or to work with CAL FIRE, or to work with these other groups? And we found that generally people are very happy to work with their neighbors, or relatively more happy to work with their neighbors and with CAL FIRE. Local planning agencies, the orange, the environmental and working landscapes people are actually more interested in working with CAL FIRE, working with a local planning agency than CAL FIRE, following a fire management plan, or working with a federal agency. People are still willing. It's just that they're less happy about working with a federal agency than they are about working with their neighbors. And there have been a number of studies lately that have shown that's what's most important for people in listening to information or advice and working with each other is feeling that they have a common culture. And so these landowners seem to feel that they have more in common with and more of a common culture, values, and norms with their neighbors than they do with a federal agency, which might be true. When we asked them, is it a good idea to work with these groups on creating wildlife areas and corridors, again, we see this same trend of working with neighbors, local planning agencies being favored over working with more distant groups. Here's rural lifestyle and financial investment. They're down here, lower down, as being interested in this. And the working landscape and environmentally oriented people, more interested in working on wildlife areas and corridors. There they are, with their neighbors and with these other groups. This is a lower down here than it was in the previous slide on fire hazard management. Okay, fine. Next slide. Again, we see that decline. Yeah, there's our arrow. Across neighbors, resource conservation districts, and a federal agency, looking at insect and disease outbreaks. I lost my little green arrow. That's it. Okay. Ah, there we are. See that decline again. With working landscapes, people most interested in insect and disease outbreaks. And, you know, it makes sense because those are probably most threatening to their way of life since it involves using the land to make an income. Environmental, again, up here, and again, financial investors least interested in cooperative management. So overall, if we look at our summary of these results, all landowners think cooperation is a good idea, but the degree to which they think it's a good idea varies with the topic and with partners, right? Landowners are least interested in cooperating or collaborating with federal agencies, and then financial investment landowners are the least interested in cooperation in general. We found, and we would say that things that are the greatest threat or most relevant, might be a way to say it, like fire hazards, really stimulate people to be interested in cooperation and working together more than something that's less relevant. So a rule for developing cooperative programs would be to make sure that the landowners see the relevance of the problem. If it seems more relevant, more of a concern, or more of an interest, it's going to be a lot easier for people to cooperate. And then if you have the right partners, people are going to be a lot more interested in cooperating. Okay, landowner outreach. Many organizations provide information to landowners, and we wanted to ask, what's the extent and impact of current landowner outreach? In the last 5 years, did you get information about land management from the following organizations? This is the question that we asked. And then we asked people to rate the quality of the advice on a 5-point scale from very low to very high. So if we just look at the question alone, we find that it really varies. A private company or a consultant, if you look at the green, that's high and very high. So people tend to devalue that a lot. And psychologically, if you pay for advice, you tend to value it quite highly in general, or are more likely to value it than if you don't pay for it, which is an interesting psychological phenomenon. But also, if you hire a private company or a consultant, they're going to be giving you advice on exactly what you want to know. Industry association, again, pretty high quality of advice. UC Cooperative Extension, local land trust, all the way down to Fish and Game and Fish and Wildlife Service. And we have some thoughts about why this might be, these might be at the bottom, and let's look at this data in a different way. If we cluster these by the weighted average of how good people thought the advice was, we can see some groupings. So here's how many received advice and how many thought it was high quality. And we thought this was valuable because probably many people never get advice from the BLM or the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that might affect the results. So if you look at this in general, if you're more likely to receive advice from an entity, you're more likely to rate that highly here. But also within that, if you're a consultant or cooperative extension or an industry association, your advice is more valued than if you're with a county fire department or CAL FIRE or the NRCS, which is interesting. These are more independent, non-governmental, we might say, in most people's minds, groups. And these are governmental groups. And as we know, our landowners in general in California are pretty concerned about regulation and about government and its role in managing natural resources. So maybe they're slightly less trusting of advice from these sources. But then when you go down here and you look over here, you've got professional organizations, conservation organizations, and land trusts. That's pretty highly valued, considering that not that many people get that kind of advice. And down here, when we look at the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, the Department of Fish and Game, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, we find these at the lower end, or the lower part of advice being valued. And our hypothesis would be, our suggestion would be, that it's because people are more nervous about advice from groups that either control or regulate natural resources. So the BLM and the Forest Service aren't really regulatory agencies, but they do have control over resources that many people feel they need for a livelihood, and maybe that makes them a little more nervous about advice. And the same is true of Fish and Wildlife and Fish and Game. Maybe the advice that they're getting they don't perceive as advice that they wanted. It's another thought. But again, the main point is that whether you want advice, whether the topic is relevant, who it comes from, is very important to people, and that's something to keep in mind if you're developing outreach programs. So, oh dear, we really can't see this, but I'll read it to you. Key findings, ownership characteristics and practices. There's differences among landowners in terms of why they own their land and the practices that they carry out, and those could be categorized into 4 different groups. Working landscapes owners are most likely to implement active management practices. There could be a variety of reasons for that. They're very involved in their land is one. They need to is another in order to maintain their livelihood and sustain their operations. Except for fire protection and defensible space. Most people are very involved in that as well, aside from our financial investors who tend to be absentee. And then the financial investment group is least likely to implement active management. To question 2 about cross-boundary cooperation, landowners are generally supportive of it. They really care who they're cooperating with and what the topic is. They want relevant topics, oops, I'm using the wrong arrow, relevant topics, and they want them to be implemented at a local level. Neighbors are their preferred cooperators. And in outreach, people are interested in advice, and they're willing to pay for it in some cases. Advice can't be separated from its source. Regulatory agency advice is not perceived as being as quote-unquote good as advice from advisory services and non-governmental organizations. Large property owners get the most advice and are most likely to get advice. So information needs to come in multiple formats from diverse sources to reach the most people. There wasn't any group that reached more than 20 or 30% of landowners in California. So people are getting advice and need to get advice from a number of sources. So landowners will collaborate when they see the direct importance, when they're comfortable with the collaborators, and when the problem is relevant to them. To conclude, reasons for owning land are definitely linked to what landowners do with their land. That's one of the first findings. Working landscape owners are most likely to be active managers. All landowners are interested in collaboration, but I think I've said this 3 times now. The strength of their interest varies by topic group and partnering agency, and landowners are more receptive to information from advisory agencies than from those who regulate or control their resources. Oh, I think I've figured out that. Okay. So I'm pretty much finished here. If you're talking about land change science, looking at that, using surveys can also be very useful in helping us improve our understanding of how society and land change together and relate to each other. There's feedbacks between natural and human drivers that shape how land is used in California and managed, and that ultimately influences the quality of life, water availability, access to food, energy, and ecosystem services. I need to acknowledge all the people that were involved in the study, which includes Christy Getz, Gary Nakamura, Bill Stewart, Sabrina Drill, Yana Valankovich, Mike DeLisso, and Maggie Kelly. All right.
Thank you.
Sure, I can hear you now, by the way. I figured that out.
Okay. And we're not having an echo either, I think.
No, I figured out that I was supposed to turn on one speaker and not the other. I'm fine.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Lynn, and I'm sorry for our technical issues up front. You did fine carrying on without your proper introduction, so thank you for doing that. We are entertaining questions for Lynn at this time. If you have a question for Lynn, please go ahead and type them in the chat box, and we will go ahead and ask her these questions. I think that you actually have addressed some of the questions as we've been going forward. The first was just some confusion about the table, and I think that you did point that out.
It's a little complicated, but I tried to make it more clear as we went along. So on the property size question, I think we could, is it okay to go back through the slides, Susie?
Sure, if you'd like to.
Okay, so we didn't categorize property owners necessarily by their size of property. It's just that in the 4 groups that we looked at, the mean acres owned, boy, this is going to take a while, were different. And so we just said, well, that's large and that's small. There's no official categorization. Let's see. So property size, oh, I didn't write down what it is. But these is just the mean property size is small in one group and large in another. And I think you could say that the smaller property size would be 100, up to 100 acres, and large would be a few hundreds of acres in terms of the mean. I'd have to look at the paper to really give you the exact number for that.
Okay, and you did actually refer to this when you started. Yes, we do have the papers loaded on our website so people can find them there. Okay, so moving on, let's see. We had a question from Moira. To what extent do any of the groups refer to the California Practices Rules, the Forest Practice Act, in decision making?
We did ask how many people were subject to the California Forest Practice Act, but we didn't ask how they use them in decision making, I'm afraid. I hope that that data is in a CalAg paper about the California Forest Practice Act.
And did that show up at all when you were asking about trustworthiness of advice?
No, no, it didn't.
Okay.
Except in the sense, we just asked, except in how people might have responded to CAL FIRE,
Yeah.
It would be contained inside of that.
Okay. Let's see, then we had a question from Susie. Is there any question about perception of tax dollars well spent and projects accomplished? Could that be why they were getting some low grades for the federal agencies and other agencies especially?
We didn't ask about that specifically. That would be very interesting. And I think that there's just a general, from the Oak Woodland survey, we asked people how they felt about government in resource management in general. And these people tend to be pretty committed to private management, both in terms of what they'd like to see on the land and how they feel the land is managed. They feel private land is managed better. Those are the kinds of things people have said in previous surveys, but we didn't ask them if that was related to perception of tax dollars. One interesting finding is that a woman named Molly Cheatham, I think is her whole name, and Pelayo Alvarez from the Defenders of Wildlife did a survey of landowners looking at whether or not they knew what ecosystem services were and whether or not they would be willing to pay for some ecosystem services, and they asked them to say how much they would want. They used a method called stated choice to be paid for specific kinds of ecosystem services, and the amount they wanted to be paid was definitely related to who was paying it. So if a Fish and Game was paying it, they wanted quite a bit more money for the same thing than if a land trust or a private organization was paying for it. It's very interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
And
so go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, I can provide the citation to that report. It's a fascinating little report.
Okay. Well, on the question of money, we had a question from Herb. How does the cost of improvements affect the implementation? So I think what he means is those practices you were asking about. Was there some difference in how much people were willing to do them based on how much they cost?
Can't tell. Can't tell from that. I guess we would have to try to, it would be very hard to use the data in that way, because when we say, for example, plant native species, well, somebody could go out and plant an oak and say, yes, I've already done that. Or somebody could plant 15 acres of oaks and say, yes, I've already done that. So any one of these practices, I think, would be hard to characterize as to whether it's expensive or not. Survey research, I was saying at the beginning that sometimes a survey isn't really the way to get at some of these things. If you want more in-depth, kind of complex information, it's very difficult to do it in a survey, because when it's written, sentences have to be pretty straightforward and clear and focused on one thing at once. But using focus groups or interviews, how does the cost of improvement affect implementation? That would be a great topic for a focus group where people could talk this out.
Do you have any plans at this point to be continuing on with this type of research or doing that sort of thing, Lynn?
Well, I'm doing some research right now looking at um, wetlands in the oak woodlands and how people manage them and how they're affected by the price of water and other concerns about water like West Nile virus and things like that. So I am doing it. We did extensive interviews, long in-depth interviews with people just to develop the survey because we really needed to know we really needed to know what the important questions were, and I find interviews are really useful for finding out what the important factors are. We're going to be sending out that survey in the summer, so if any of you get it, please answer it. We need answerers.
Great. Okay, well, we had a question from Eloise about how to contact you.
Okay, so I am at huntsinger@berkeley.edu. It's pretty simple.
And at the very end, also, I have a series of hot web links, which means that when you click on them, you can get there. And we have Lynn's homepage, and you should be able to get to her that way as well.
Now, there's another question, right?
Right. So from Dave, did forest product landowners differ from cattle ranchers in their clustering or their attitudes?
Not necessarily. I thought that was pretty interesting, and this is a question that I can explore with the data, and I'd like to very much. So I have plans for further data analysis. As a range person, I've only studied, my previous surveys have all been about range, and the wetland survey is too. So I'd like to look more at how they might be different from forest producers or timber producers or forest landowners. And I plan to do that in the not too distant future. So that's a good question. But there were surprising similarities. They didn't show up as being something that differentiated. When you do this cluster analysis, it looks at all these different variables, and they didn't pull out as being different.
So Lynn, I have a question for you, and I know there is a periodic nationwide survey of forest landowners. That is used pretty commonly by agencies. Is your project related to that in any way? Or
that's the FIA survey. What was it called?
The National Woodland Owner Survey, I think is what it's called.
We probably got ideas from it and reviewed it, but we weren't related in any way. Yeah. And when you do a survey, you want to look through all the different kinds of surveys there are and try to develop your questions with knowledge of that, but no, we didn't.
Okay.
Weren't related to that. I think our data is it's specific to California and to those particular counties, so it's a little more fine-grained, I think.
All right. Well, that's really useful. I am seeing a few questions coming up. They seem to be a bit slow coming up. So what I'm going to do is pull up our final. Let's see. That shouldn't be there. I'll bring up our final pod here while we answer our last questions, if there are more. And just wanted to point out to everybody that in the bottom left-hand corner, there are some web links, and you can get to our webinar homepage there. There's a webinar online evaluation that we hope you will take and let us know what you thought and give us your feedback. That's very helpful to us as planning future webinars. And then there's a link to Lynn's lab webpage at UC Berkeley. And if you click there, you should be able to find all her information and how to get a hold of her. Okay, so it looks like we have a couple more questions. Another one from Dave Passavoy at CAL FIRE. Do you have any thoughts on the solutions from the land question?
Okay.
Sponsored by the Farm Foundation and the Nature Conservancy? Do you know what he's talking about?
No, but I have an idea.
The land question, yeah.
Yeah, I think that things that are sponsored by these, obviously the results of this research imply that more landowners are going to be more receptive to ideas that come from the private sector, from foundations and land trusts. And so I think that these things in general are very interesting and a very good idea. I don't know specifically about what Solutions from the Land is doing. I've been looking at some other, what you might call grassroots groups or groups of landowners getting together and deciding they're going to do things for their communities. And those can be quite effective and engage a lot of people that simply won't be engaged by top-down sorts of things. So Carl, do investors ever buy into lands having an agriculture easement? Well, we have a very small number. I would say yes, I know somebody that did actually. And in fact, I would say sometimes investors want to develop a property and they do some kind of set-aside of agriculture or conservation easements in order to get what they want in terms of developing the rest of the land. That definitely happens. Investors also are buying into land that they're using as mitigation banks, right? And those would have mitigation easements on them. One thing about the survey is I believe we had 6% of landowners had conservation easements on their properties. That's a pretty small number to draw big conclusions about from just that number. But I do definitely personally know of investors who have done that, who've gotten an agricultural easement on property. And I believe if you look at land that has very high amenity value, like around Jackson Hole, the fact that there's an agricultural or conservation easement on it, theoretically it should reduce the price of the property, but in reality, because it's so attractive to very wealthy people who want sort of a trophy ranch or maybe a trophy forest, it doesn't really affect property values that much, which is a good thing for investors, maybe not such a good thing for those of us who want to see the lands actively used. Does that help with that question?
So Carl, if you're still there, go ahead and type in whether or not that's what you're asking. That would be great, or any other feedback. Last call for questions. Are there any more questions out there for Lynn? Go ahead and type them in. Lynn, thank you so much. That was
you're welcome.
Very interesting, and I know working for Cooperative Extension, we find the results very useful as a way to help structure our outreach, and I'm sure that's the case for others who are engaged in that work. I wanted to, Lynn, since I didn't do your introduction, can I do it as a capping statement? So here it is. Dr. Huntsinger is Professor of Rangeland Ecology and Management at Berkeley. Her research focuses on conservation and management of rangelands and the interaction of social and ecological systems in working landscapes in the western U.S. And she's published numerous papers based on survey research starting in 1985 with the Integrated Hardwood Range Management Program. And a survey about California oak woodland landowners. The URL to her homepage is in that hot link section, and it gives you a link to her list of publications and projects. And she's most recently edited a book to be published this summer comparing oak woodlands in California and Spain. So we're looking forward to that as well. I don't see any additional questions, so I think with that, we'll say thank you very much, Lynn, and let everyone know that we have one more webinar coming up on June 17th with Dr. Bill Stewart. It's a carbon calculator for sustainable forestry operations.